with a lot of those regulations, and that was by choice, because there's a lot of companies out there slapping the bourbon logo on stuff, even though it wasn't really bourbon. You had some companies in Europe basically mixing some chemicals together, trying to make a 10-year-old bourbon in 2 months. It didn't work for us. The bourbon A has to be made in America. There's a common misconception that it has to be made here in Kentucky. It doesn't have to be made here in Kentucky, although 95% of the world's bourbon is made here in Kentucky. 95% of that 95% is made within a 40-mile radius of Barton, Kentucky. Other thing is it has to be at least 51% corn. You can make up the rest of the 49% out of different grains. It has to be an unadulterated grain, so it has to be a grain spirit. You can't add any flavors or coloring to it. You can't distill it over 150 proof. You have to cut it back down. You can't put it into a barrel over 125 proof. Once it's in that barrel, it has to go into a brand new charred white oak barrel. You can only use that barrel once for bourbon. It has to be brand new. It has to be charred. Now, in order to be a Kentucky straight bourbon whiskey, you have to sit in that barrel in the state of Kentucky for 3 years. Now, technically, it's bourbon as soon as it hits that wood. So those kind of go into everything that creates bourbon. And we'll touch on those as we go through the distilling process and kind of see where that comes into play. So let's talk about our distillery. Now, this is the Barton 1792 distillery. We've had several other different names. This is actually the second distillery that's been on this property. The original distillery sat up the road about a quarter mile as the Willett and Frankie distillery. Now, somewhere in the process, Willett had 2 daughters. In came these 2 guys, Tom Moore and Ben Mattingly. Married both of the daughters. Now, these 2 guys were both distillers, so guess what they did? Got it in Daddy's business. So at some point, Mr. Willett signed off the distillery rights to Tom Moore and Ben Mattingly. They started producing a bourbon called Mattingly & Moore, still out on the market today, although we don't produce it. There's some falling out in the business process. Tom Moore leaves the Mattingly & Moore distillery, comes not even a quarter mile down the road, and sets up this distillery in 1879. So, why is this distillery where it's at? Why is bourbon made here in Kentucky? A lot of it goes into the water here. Our water, we sit on a limestone plateau. All of our water is filtered through that limestone. What does the limestone do? Takes out the iron, puts calcium in the water. Makes great bourbon. Also, it's great in strengthening the bones and racehorses. That's why you see horses and bourbon. Now, our water comes from a natural spring. You sit in what's called a hollow, or here in Kentucky, a holler. It's like a small valley in between 2 hills, so that you'll see a big hill over there, and you probably came down the big hill on this side. So in this holler, there's over a dozen springs. There are 2 never-fail springs. One fueled the original distillery, and then the Tom Moore spring still operates this distillery today. Now you probably think 1879, a natural spring coming out of the hill. How do you get all that bourbon out of that spring? Of course, our production is a lot bigger, so we have a 28-acre lake, hot property that we pump in water from as additional water. We also have city water that we use for some of the maintenance aspects. So, water, and then also access to grains. This road here in the middle of the distillery, this is in US 31, which is now at the top of the hill. You can imagine how busy it is. Also, it was what was called the Barton Greenbelt Highway, or Green River Turnpike. Basically, it's shot right down next to the Fort Knox. To give you a little history about the distillery here. If you look at our distillery, you'll notice there's kind of a hodgepodge of brickwork. The large limestone blockwork here is part of the original 1879 distillery. At some point in the early 1900s, they added the yellow brickwork. At that time, the rest of the distillery was all wood clapboard. Now, there was kind of a bad point in American history for the bourbon industry, 20s and 30s, called Prohibition. There was only a few distilleries in the United States that were able to stay open. We were not one of them. Basically, you have this distillery sitting out here, doing a little bit of nothing, still our bourbons in our warehouses, but we're not making whiskey. After Prohibition's repeal, we started making whiskey. It wasn't too long after that that the U.S. forces joined World War II. In World War II, the U.S. government went to a lot of the industries and asked them to join the war effort in some form or fashion. We, of course, were one of them. The way we did that was to start producing weapons-grade alcohol. So fuel for like torpedoes, that kind of thing. If you think about some good old boys in a holler in central Kentucky producing weapons-grade alcohol in a wooden distillery. Boom. So, that wood clapboard distillery is now a pile of rubble. Late 40s gentleman from Chicago comes down named Oscar Getz. He's a businessman, owns a liquor distributing company out of Chicago. It's still one of the bigger distributing companies up there. Buys up the distillery and starts making whiskey. That's where you see the red brickwork coming. When he rebuilt the distillery, you can see some of the Art Deco lines in the brickwork that were typical of that day. Everything was bright, new, and shiny. Everything was updated, state of the art. We're still state of the art today for 1946. So, we, of course, have computerized everything. It only takes about 6 guys to run the still during the shift. However, there's a lot of equipment still in place from 1946. I'll point some of those out. Anybody have any questions so far? Okay. What we're going to do is we're going to cross the road here. We're going to go down to grain receiving, work our way through the distilling process. We're going to go see a warehouse. Then we'll go through the bottling line, and then our favorite part is the taste, right? Right this way.